Hi, I'm Bonnie Steinroeder, and I'm the pastor.
And I'm John Moore, and I'm the policeman. Tonight, we are discussing a book. We're moving on from the Fourth Amendment, which was our last topic. And tonight, we're talking about free speech. And the vehicle for that conversation will be a book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech Instead of Censorship. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having a studio audience, a very diverse group. They're going to get involved in the conversation, particularly because this is about free speech. But before we go into any of the specifics about the book or the topics that we'd like to discuss, we'd like to thank all of our veterans today. Today is Veterans Day. We actually have three in the studio audience. Phil Rubin, who served with the United States Navy, Steve Bradford with the United States Navy as well, Chief Bill George with the United States Army, and thank you for your service to the three of you and all of our viewers out there that were veterans. So, Bonnie?
Well, I'm so excited that we're here tonight with a studio audience because the whole reason we started this show was to start a conversation about the Bill of Rights, about the Constitution, and not to have pat answers, but again, to really have a discussion. So the First Amendment and hate speech, I was telling John a few weeks ago, I thought I evolved on this issue, and I've kind of devolved on it. So I'll be interested to see what the studio audience has to say. When I was a young woman, I was very involved with a group called Women Against Pornography. And I felt that was really important work. I felt that, I still do, feel that pornography is demeaning to women. But then one of the things that happened as we were doing that, there was a book published, I'm dating myself, called Our Bodies, Ourselves by the Boston Women's Health Collective. This is back in the 1980s. It was a book about women's health. And all of a sudden, that book started to become banned as pornography. In my view, it was so far from that. But what it helped me to understand is that if we're going to ban certain books, if we're going to ban certain parts of speech, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what's obscene? Who gets to decide what's okay? And so then, really very reluctantly, I came down on the side that this law professor comes down on, where we have to allow free speech. If we don't allow free speech, then, again, who gets to decide what that is? And kind of the theory, if we bring it out into the sunlight, sunlight is the best disinfectant. But I will say, when I say I've devolved on that a little bit, we've never had a situation where so much of the hate speech is coming from the very highest ranks of government. We've never had that before. And we've had a rise of hate, a rise of anti-Semitism, a rise of violence against people who are gay and lesbian and transgender. So I really find myself caught in between saying, we need to allow free speech. It's in the Constitution. And then yet, as a private citizen, how do I stand up? How do I stand up for the values of who I think we are as a nation? And how do I stand up for people who are being maligned and oppressed and the victims of violence? So that's kind of like my little journey. Do you want to say a word?
Well, I mean, part of that same conversation that I had with you was that flag burning is considered a form of expression, considered a form of free speech. And I've always had a problem with that, but I need to, I've evolved also, and I need to respect people's right to free speech. Now, it can be both. You can be disgusted by that happening, but you can also say that based on our Constitution and the right of free speech and the First Amendment, it can be done. Now, the First Amendment, I'm not going to read the whole amendment, but it says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. In reading this book, the author, who is a very accomplished law professor at NYU, speaks about hate speech. And our first reaction usually is that we're offended by it, we're repulsed by it, and we want to either restrict it or eliminate it. But she says take a second look. And there are other ways of dealing with it other than getting a government involved. So I'm going to throw this out to the studio audience. If you've read the book or the conversations that we've had before the show today, you know what the definition of hate speech. It's usually something that's demeaning or degrading to a group, usually groups that might have been discriminated against in the past. I'd like to put it out to you, have you ever either witnessed or been subjected to hate speech? What did you do about it? What did you want maybe someone else to do about it? Do we have anybody in the studio audience that might want to speak to that? And I know it's a tough subject to start, but we need someone to jump in.
Great, we have a volunteer.
I'll take the hit for as the first question. So, Matt Y, I'm a police officer in town. I guess my example would be the recent anti-police rhetoric that has been going around just in general in terms of the job. So my personal opinion, and after reading the book and everything, I do agree with the author. When you take the oath as a police officer, not only are you promising to protect the rules and regulations of the town and the state, but you're also defending the Constitution. And I think that is the main aspect that a lot of police officers have to realize. You don't take that kind of speech as personal, but while you're dealing with it, you're actually defending the First Amendment. So,
okay, I'd add to that, and I completely agree with Matt about that sentiment. It hurts to hear that speech, but you have to allow it. And you are a public employee, a public figure. So your tolerance has to be at a higher level than, say, someone that's, feeling it from a personal standpoint. You're a public figure. They're addressing you as a public figure. Your tolerance has to be higher. But would anyone else want to speak to it? Steve Bradford.
Okay, one of the things that you said, John, was about in her book, she talks about hate speech being more towards groups that were previously discriminated against. Well, that might have been true before, but I don't think it's necessarily the rule now. I think it applies to all groups, whether you've been previously discriminated against as a group or if you're just part of the majority. And it's gotten to an extreme. This goes back to something that Bonnie said, where there's more rhetoric coming out by all groups against other groups. And I don't know, one of the things when I signed on the dotted line was, to protect the Constitution. And I have to make myself think about that whenever I hear hate speech, or what I interpret to be hate speech, that one of the reasons that we fought or served was to allow people the right to say whatever they want to, and almost not within reason anymore. So that's an issue that I have there.
Yeah. You want to speak to
Well,
that?
I was just going to say, so when I was a young person, and I would go to a lot of protests, and that was actually my job. I had a job as a full-time political activist. They don't pay much, but they do have, at least back then, they had those jobs. And I remember going to protests, and people would scream at me angrily, saying, if you don't love this country, then why don't you leave it? You should be glad you live in a country where you can say what you think. And I remember thinking to myself, I am glad that I live here. I am glad I can say what I think. Why don't you want me to do that? And what made me think of it is one day there was a veteran who came up to me and he goes, I fought so that you would have this right, and I'm so glad you're exercising it. So I think that's a very powerful thing, to realize that people aren't going to say always what we think they should say, but it is their right to say it.
Right. Where would you draw the line, especially in terms of our government? Once you say that certain hate speech will be restricted or will be either civilly or criminally sanctioned, then you have to do it for all types of hate speech. And like I said earlier, restrictions on speech, whether it be just regular speech or hate speech, is by a government. But if we're in a private realm, like, say, the internet, then there are different rules that apply. Now, I'm sure most of the people in the room here have some type of social media platform that they speak out on and that they witness speech on, and that you've probably witnessed hate speech on. What's your opinion in terms of how it's being handled by social media? Are they too restrictive? Are they not restrictive at all? Are they selective? What do you think? Yes.
Well, you have to concern yourself with when does it cross over into an extreme. Mm-hmm. Suppose I'm witnessing hate speech that evolves into advocating for violence. Mm-hmm. Now, that's in effect advocating a criminal act.
Right.
Right.
Can you stop it then?
I would hope so.
Well, I mean, then you get into the difficult position that law enforcement is in, and I'll speak to that, and then I'll turn to my active law enforcement partner in the group and ask him, but it does put law enforcement in a difficult position. They're presented with a set of facts. The base upon which they work off of is it is free speech. We are the government. We can't restrict it, but it gets into law enforcement's discretion as to whether or not it's crossed that line into a crime, whether it be a threat, whether it be a building conspiracy, or in this day and age, whether it be something along the lines of terrorism. Matt, would you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I would agree. It has certainly gotten very diluted in terms of even 12 years ago when I first started, the ability of social media and people to spread their messages and everything. It's difficult. It's a scale. It teeters and totters both ways, and you're really susceptible to making rash decisions, and you kind of have to live with those.
Right.
The job has gotten a lot tougher in today's day and age,
right.
with the prevalence of social media and everything, and we're being asked to do a lot more than I think what a lot of people signed up for originally 20, 30 years ago. So.
Right. I mean, 2 points to that, or 1 point in particular. I think everybody in the room is probably aware of a recent criminal case where a young lady was convicted, and it's on appeal. She was convicted of manslaughter for texting certain words that might be considered free speech, but it crossed over the line into the criminal realm.
This is when she wanted when her boyfriend
Yes.
killed himself,
Right.
and she told him to get back in
Right.
the car.
Right. But then, in law enforcement, and we'd have these long discussions about it, it's, is that a crime? I mean, we're going to probably tie it back to our last show in terms of probable cause. All right? We're thinking about a possible crime. Is it more probable than not that those words amount to a crime? And if they did, then that person is possibly going to be charged, and in that case, she was. So did you want to add something to that?
I think, well, just going back a little bit, I mean, what I'd be interested in hearing you talk about, too, is that, again, I think why I go back and forth, I'm all for free speech until I see neo-Nazis with tiki torches screaming, "Jews will not replace us," in Charlottesville, and someone ends up dead. Before I see someone who's been radicalized on the internet around anti-Semitism who walks into a temple and shoots and kills 12 people shouting that all the Jews should die. And what I think I get mixed up on sometimes, or what's hard for me, are those just my emotions that I feel so sad that that's what we've become as a country? And how can we combat that? Or is it a free speech issue? So that, I don't want to hear that speech. I don't want to see those people marching. Catherine, did you have a comment?
Yes, to your point and some things I've been thinking about. We easily say the word free speech, but I have to ask, who defined free?
Right.
And, what is the group of people who make the call about what is free? And what is the group of people that make the call about what is hate? And we have, I think, sometimes a false illusion, and maybe it's a necessary illusion, that the private and public can be separated, and that the law and the personal can be separated. And yet all of us come out of cultures, familial cultures, community cultures, national cultures, religious cultures, where these standards are really set. We still live in a country without an equal rights amendment. We still have, and you face this in law enforcement, you arrive at a domestic violence situation where there's probably been a huge amount of hate speech go on for maybe a long time, either gender towards either partner. And you have to discern in that situation, has this crossed the line?
Right.
Or do you just de-escalate that? Isn't, in some ways, the drama we play out in that setting, which is a huge epidemic in the country, isn't that somehow related to how we see, the rights of these various groups as part of our culture? How are they in our culture? How much do they get to make these definitions?
Right.
And so I'm stuck with, as a person who's worked in these areas of differences, let's be realistic about the water we swim in and how big our view can be. And if we don't continually ask, from where am I coming when I make these calls? And I decide who gets to say what. And I compare my situation, which might be one of great privilege, to someone who is, worried about their safety in their household or worried about their right to vote. Am I really being realistic about how free their speech is versus mine? So I think we always have to ask about context. Right. We always have to ask who's in power. We have to look at the Supreme Court and say, who are these people who get to make this choice, and who are they right now, and where do they come from? Right. So those are the things that make it always a murky water for me, and always one where I think this kind of discourse is critical.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody want to add to that? Yes.
Great.
I think the one question that I would ask, you as a panel out there, is who makes the decision as to what is the limit that we can actually speak or say these horrible things to people about their different religions? Going back on what she said and what the gentleman there said too. Who makes that decision? Because anything, I could think of a word that was used as really bad, and I would not like to use it. Mm-hmm. But somebody else might think, oh, it's okay, it's all right, you can use it. So who makes that decision? That's one thing. And the second thing is, when people at high levels of our government, if they are already using things like hate speech and they're bringing it out there, then it trickles down to the common people. And so how can common people, even stop doing what they're doing? Because there's someone right on top who's already doing it.
Right.
And so nobody wants to, stop this. So,
right. And I would say to your second point, maybe John can address the first, I don't think we've ever had that before. I can't remember a president, I can't remember in the upper echelons before where there's ever, any president I've ever could remember, no matter what their party, has tried to diffuse differences, has tried to bring us together. That is not the case right now. Demonizing people in caravans, demonizing immigrants, we've never had that before. So, right, as a country, how do we handle that? And I don't know if you have any comment about the first part.
2 points, and I don't say these because I agree with them, but the type of speech that you're talking about can qualify as political speech, which is afforded the highest amount of protection under our Constitution. We don't like it, but if it's talking about policies and politics and things that affect us in general, then it needs to be protected. On the other hand, when you said who makes a decision as to whether or not this type of speech will be restricted, I mean, one of the examples we've used already is law enforcement. If there's an independent criminal act attached to that speech, then law enforcement can act on it. And if they act on it in such a way that a person is arrested or charged with a crime, then for the time being, the speech is suppressed, but not forever.
Yeah. Did Eva?
Yeah, I was just thinking about also, how we define and think about what is harm. Mm-hmm. I think that we're in some interesting territory because we talk about, the rights of political speech and the freedom to sort of, to say or advocate for policies that fall in the political realm. But at what point do we, start to sort of steer ourselves into defaming people or instigating violence in some way? That I think there's just a lot of questions we have to be asking ourselves about who makes those decisions and how we define that speech, because it's a really dangerous and heated space. And then I think, too, that it's also a question not just about how we're defining harm to others and how we define violence or, creating situations that lead to violence, but also how we respond. So I think that, part of the conversation is about, well, do we support free speech and where do we limit it? But I think we also have to ask ourselves, even as a community, how do we respond to it? Because we're not, even in our small town of Holliston, we're not, divorced from these conflicts. Whether they're swastikas in our high school bathrooms, whether it's the N-word that showed up on a box in Stoddard Park with my kids doing soccer pictures behind it, this language and this sort of hate speech exists, even in our own community. And so I think it's a call to action to think, too, about how we respond to it.
One of the things I'd say to that is, and one of the things that's advocated in the book, is counter speech. You speak out against it. And Bonnie and I were talking several times about the book before we arrived here tonight. And one of the things we mentioned was you saw what happened in Charlottesville. And then, I don't know if it was 2 weeks later, there was a planned rally in Boston Common.
Right.
Same type of group or same agenda. And other groups, other people, the general populace came out and said, you know what, we're going to be there too, and we're going to speak against it. And there were, maybe 20 or 30 that showed up, and they had to be protected by the Boston police and escorted out once they finally said, you know what, this isn't going to work. So that was a perfect example of counter speech.
That is true.
And that's what's advocated, and that's what I would advise as well.
Right. No, I do think that's true. One thing, too, that we can do as citizens, I was just thinking about this on the way over. I don't know if any of you watched Saturday Night Live or heard about Saturday Night Live, but the week before last, one of the comedians made fun of a war veteran who had lost his eye. I don't remember how, but he lost it in combat, and he made fun of him, and it was completely, that was hate speech. It was really inappropriate. And then the next week, he called the veteran, he apologized to him, and he came on the show. And I watched the clip today, because I don't stay up late enough to watch Saturday Night Live. And they were on the show together. The comedian apologized to the veteran. He accepted the apology. And then, of course, it's a comedy show. He goes, okay, so now you get to say some things about me. And they showed pictures of the comedian, and then the veteran was saying, yeah, you look like a troll, you look, or whatever. But I thought, sometimes I think that we undervalue the power in relationships, that we can also come together when we make a mistake and we step over the line. There is a lot of power in personal relationships to heal that, and two people coming together from probably very different perspectives politically and in every other way to say, I'm sorry, yes, I accept your apology, and to move on. There's so much power in that, and we don't do that enough.
Another thing that's mentioned in the book is the power of, along those same lines, restorative justice, which means you bring the victim and the offender together, like in this case they did on, of all places, Saturday Night Live, and they worked it out, and there was an apology. And I believe it was a Navy SEAL
That's right.
who had lost his eye in combat. And he brought both himself and this comedian together, but I think everybody in that audience and everybody that was watching it, because it made me feel good, the comedian's father actually died on 9/11 in New York City. And he brought that up, and he said, we need to honor anybody that's sacrificed, including this comedian's father, for the sacrifice they've made, brought the country together. And that was a good form of both restorative justice and counter speech all in one. So anybody want to comment on that? Or yes?
Yeah, Ken Henderson. I've been thinking, too, as we've been speaking tonight, and it often revolves around freedom and yet there's responsibility that goes with exercising your freedom. So it's almost a two-sided story. And values play right into it. I know Reverend Bonnie are my minister, so that values...
Hear a lot of my values.
So values play into how we react, because why do we feel bad? Well, it somehow attacked one of our values. Just to take a little different area, the area of the media, if you hear it often enough, you start to believe it a little. And that could be good if it's about something positive and reinforcing the kind of things we'd like in our values. But if you hear something often enough, it starts to sink in a little. And I'm wondering why the media then, in their own way, can't backspeak by not covering everything negative that happens again and again. How often does a commentator get on and say, well, it happened again? Whether it be, unfortunately, a shooting or whether it were another way that we have demeaned one another. So why are we so caught up in the mentality that we want to cover this stuff as opposed to, it does almost sound in the back of my mind a little bit like censorship, but here's an independent agency, a news media, saying, no, we're not going to cover that garbage because it goes against our corporate values.
See, they want to make money, right?
Well, that's the
why they do it. That's
sell
their biggest
newspapers
corporate
or
value,
keep their
right.
audience or whatever.
I think that's a great question.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes.
Steve?
I think something that's developed over the last few years, not just in the last 2 or 3, but extremism. We get to the point where there's the far left and the far right, and the middle has almost disappeared. And, it used to be you could say something and then, that went away. But now it gets picked up and dragged way over here or dragged way over here. And there's no common ground anymore. People don't come together to say, yeah, well, this is that, and I don't believe that type of thing. And then you're still friends. But now it seems like you drag it way out to the extremes, and I think a lot of families and friendships have been ruined by extremism.
Right. I'd add to that. Any conversation has to start with respect. And if it starts with disrespect, then the other side isn't listening to your argument. I was trained as a lawyer, and one of the things you learn about, your demeanor in the courtroom is that you need to respect everybody there, not just the judge, but in particular the attorney on the other side. And that's why they refer to, if it's a female on the other side, you say my sister. If it's a male, you say my brother, and you say, I've heard that argument. It might have some merit, but this is the reason why my argument should carry the day. It's too bad that can't be the rules of engagement in conversations in the general public, but maybe we can move in that direction. Maybe somebody here has an idea on how we can do that. Bonnie? I put you on the spot.
Well, I was going to say, I grew up in New Jersey. I come from the demographic that people talk about all the time that support the more conservative. Neither of my mother didn't graduate high school. My father never. I was the first one to go to college. I come from that white, working class, non-college educated demographic. And all of my family were conservative, and yet somehow they gave birth to me. And, and so that has been an interesting challenge over our lives that, I've always thought differently. I went to college. It helped me to think in some different ways. I moved to Boston. I left my little town in New Jersey. But I think that I love my family. They love me. What we do is we just don't discuss these things at holidays. We talk about other things like, how's Cousin Kira's first dance going, or whatever. And so I think there are ways, that, again, talking about the Saturday Night Live, we need to solve it too interpersonally, but it is really hard to figure out. I think my tolerance for hate speech has gotten less and less over the years. And I feel like I look at it and I say, again, I think it's just with deep sadness. I'm like, how how did we come to this, where we have so much in common as Americans, and yet there's so much hate and distrust. And so I'm all for trying to repair that.
So we're
Yes.
going to,
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, we're going to try to juggle two balls now. We have a question from,
From
that's
Linda
a friend of
Schumacher.
yours, right?
She's one of my parishioners.
Okay.
She says, when does free speech become a threat to personal safety? And is a threat considered free speech when the speaker claims it was not intended as a threat? I'm going to turn that to law enforcement.
I'll throw it over to Matt. Like I said earlier, in answer to this question, if a law enforcement official decides that maybe someone has stepped over the line into the criminal realm, they use their own discretion, they use the principle of probable cause, and they make a decision as to whether or not it's a threat. Now, I use the example sometimes when I teach other classes. If a 5-year-old boy comes in here and he stands next to me and he says, "I'm going to kill you," that's not a threat based on that context. If we have someone that comes in here and he's 6'7", 6'8", and he's 350 pounds and he says, "I'm going to kill you," that's a threat. Everyone understands the difference in terms of the context. So, Matt, you want to add anything to that in terms of?
No, I think you got it. I think it really comes down to the discretion of the officer in that situation, and they have to make that decision in real time.
But what about us as citizens, too? So say we're on the subway, and somebody is hassling someone because they're Muslim or for whatever other reason, or because they're a woman. To me, that's where it really breaks down around the free speech, because I do not think that someone should have to endure being called names in public, and they feel the threat. So then what do we do? As if we're not law enforcement, if we're private citizens, I feel like well, I'll just give you this one example, too, right here in Holliston. One of my parishioners is Asian. She went to Casey's. She was meeting with another parishioner, and they were talking, they were having a beer, and some of the people at the bar started taking their eyes and making fun of her eyes and saying things. She got up and walked out. Not one person in Casey's stood up for her. Not one person who worked there. Not one person who was sitting there having a beer. Not one person stood up for her. And when her husband asked her, "Why didn't you stand up for yourself?" she said, "Because I was afraid." That doesn't feel like free speech to me. That feels like something beyond that.
Right. I mean, I don't say this to be funny in any way. No one spoke up, but probably somebody filmed it. People are quicker with their phones than they are to intervene these days. And it's unfortunate that no one intervened, or that she didn't go to the bartender and say, I got a problem with this other patron.
Well, it was a whole group.
Yeah. Well,
That was
whether
there.
it be an individual or a group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to kind of jump off that point in terms of filming it, and I was going to go off of Steve's point, do you find, and I'll toss the question back to you, do you think the prevalence of social media and the ability for people to be more anonymous, and that lack of respect with interpersonal relationships, do you think that has been one of the main issues why we have seen so much hate speech?
Absolutely. We saw plenty of it in terms of many criminal cases that were built off of social media. And when people retreat to these silos and don't communicate personally to other people, only by way of a keyboard with either a fake name or an anonymous name, then they become much more brave. And lots of times, unfortunately, they become hateful. And that's a problem, but it's a problem I don't know how to solve. I don't know how to reel it back. Maybe someone in the crowd does.
So this just makes me think a little bit about our young people, and being a parent of 3 kids and 2 teenagers. That I see this all the time. I mean, Snapchat, you ridicule, it disappears. Right? The only way you capture these things is to do screenshots. And so it really does embolden, I think, our youth to be cruel. And I think that the response is that we need to be proactive about teaching what freedom and the privilege of having the freedom to have free speech looks like. And I don't think we do enough, and I think we need to do more, but I think we're in a new frontier, particularly watching our young people sort of, engage in this behavior at a very young age, which I think, sets them on a path for behavior like this as they grow older.
Right.
So.
I want to ask John a question.
Sure.
To what extent do you see the difference, and this may be more legal than law enforcement, but if you as a police officer are aware of something on the internet that is cruel, that advocates a negative position on something, can you do anything about that? Or is that more of a legal question?
Sure. I mean, you can, no one ever stops a law enforcement officer from having a conversation with someone. I think, and I don't put Matt Warr in this category, but I think there are some officers, very young officers, that think if I'm not investigating a crime or going on a call, I can't talk to anyone. No one stops you from going to the door and knocking on the door and having a conversation. You don't have to take a criminal action. And we've done it plenty of times, right? When I was chief, I encouraged it. If you can stop something before it actually becomes something by way of a conversation, why not? Anybody else want to add to that? Or, yeah.
So to go
Chief.
back to some of the comments that were made earlier with regards to something that happens on the subway and why don't people step in, or something that happens at a local establishment, I know for a long time the Secret Service was looking at the issue of school safety, and they looked at what is referred to as the bystander effect. And why is it that people know that something is going to be happening but don't tell a trusted adult that could possibly change the outcome of targeted school violence? And that was a very meaningful study that the Secret Service did. And then also I've seen some recent research related to what's referred to as the spiral of silence, which has to do with the psychological effect of when it would appear that a majority of the group in which one finds oneself is voicing a certain opinion, then others will not speak up. And so I think that would explain, you question, why didn't anyone speak up at the local establishment when something clearly was offensive and inappropriate? I think what happens is, psychologically, you've heard of the fight or flight mentality that happens, and psychologists have recently come out with the fact that there's actually a third impact which happens when people face fear, which is freeze. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And I think that's what is happening in our society. And to the sergeant's point earlier of, we're so depersonalized, we're not used to interacting with people in person because we're used to hiding behind a keyboard. So when something offensive happens in front of us, oftentimes we don't have the skill set or we don't feel equipped to be able to intervene.
Good points.
It's a great point. And I
Thanks,
asked
Chief.
myself, would I have intervened, right? It's a great question. Catherine?
Yeah, I just want to underscore what you said and go back to your questions, some of your questions about, why things don't happen and how we've gotten polarized to such a degree. And, my belief working in some of these fields and, in psychology is that we're really in a position now where we really have to start with the supposition that people are in fear, that, behind aggression, behind a lack of desire to take action, behind polarization, behind getting on the internet and fortifying your position, behind a lot of these behaviors, affiliating with a strange group of people for yourself just to feel included, is fear, or fear and anxiety. And that if we could only, interpersonally and on every level of the organization, the system, the country, start with the supposition that I'm anxious and you're anxious, and we're trying to pretend we're having a political discussion when what's down here is fear about my security, fear about my children, my family, fear about my beliefs. And, if only we can remember that, then we can take the first step of putting the other person first, seeing them as in our shoe and saying, the thing we want to hear when we're at the grocery store counter, how are you today? What's your day been like? I mean, that's my personal peace protest every day is to make every interaction count and be an act of peace, because I think we are so fearful.
Yeah.
And there's really no reason why I can't talk to an arch conservative with peace and with compassion and build that first step. But we're so far away from that, maybe because of the role of technology and because of our feeling that we need to belong to these groups in order to feel safe. And it has the opposite effect.
I mean, to play off your point, I thought it was great. If people could only get to the point where they admit up front, I'm real nervous here, you scare me, you know, or on the other end of it, and I ran into this when I was a police officer, to disarm people when they come in. You know, they're going to be talking to somebody that's in uniform. They don't typically go into a police station. They have something on their mind, and they think they're going to be met with someone with a very loud voice that's going to say, get to the point. I need to know what you're here for. Take them into a back room and say to them, you know, what can I do for you? You know, I'm here to help. And then, you know, it's a respectful conversation, and it works.
Yeah.
So.
I think I want to go back to the point on the bystander effect. So now with social media, hate speech has become so common. You go on any news article and there turns into a political debate that just suddenly it's not even about the politics at that point. It's just person to person. But how does the bystander effect, do you think, transfer when you're just scrolling through social media and you see this? What's your responsibility at that point?
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I honestly, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, even if you're looking on the ABC News article, obviously you don't know these people who are fighting.
Like
but
all the comments that people are putting on, yes.
Yeah.
Right, and then you think, do I want to get in the middle of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my response to that would be, you know, take the chance and get involved. Maybe it's nothing, but you certainly don't want something to pass you by. I mean, maybe I'll throw it back to my friend the chief, because he's done a lot of work with school safety, and the slogan from the federal government, see something, say something. And, you know, with all the mass shootings that we've had this year, the last figure I saw was 307 in the first 311 days. And for it to be a mass shooting, you have to have at least 4 people die. That is an incredible number, and it's so depressing to hear it. But what I tell people when I teach classes, especially criminal justice classes, is somebody always knows something beforehand. Something has always been said, but no one has relayed it to someone else. Chief, you want to play off of that a little?
Sure. No, to Kristen's point, I think one of the most meaningful statements in this book, and as we mentioned when I was chatting with you before the show started taping, didn't agree with everything. I'm on a different part of the spectrum than the author. But one of the most meaningful statements in the book appeared on 173, where it says, we should develop thicker skin on behalf of ourselves and thinner skin on behalf of others.
I love
because
that, too.
Sometimes people get, and this goes back to your point earlier with regards to what does harm look like. Sometimes people get offended about something that genuinely doesn't directly impact them and really doesn't. And I understand your point, Bonnie, about being sad and feeling the weight of people's actions and when there's a tragedy. But there are some times where people are getting upset on the internet about things that aren't honestly life and death. And to Kristen's point earlier, I agree. There's a lot of stuff that happens in comment sections on media that just become a cesspool.
I agree.
It's really sad.
And what you said, though, was just, you know, quoting her, right? That's so lovely, that thicker skin for ourselves, but the thinner skin for others is about empathy. That's what it's saying. Have empathy, have compassion. That old saying, you know, that in my age group, you know, your parents said, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, you know. That will get you really far. Yeah, that's beautiful.
I think the other thing comes with respect. It's a respect that you can have for each other. And then I think automatically you'll be able to understand where the other person is coming from. And if you make it, we won't be able to change the whole world at one time. But if we do it in our own little small pockets, then I think that might, you know, that pay it forward, it might work, and maybe that'll make a difference. I mean, that's the way I look at it myself, but I don't know if that's the way everyone else does, but, you know,
Yeah, an
bystander
example goes a long ways.
Yeah.
You know, someone sets
So-
an example and word gets around, and
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So to the book's point about censorship, I think it's really interesting. These are really interesting times, and I think that, you know, hate speech has always been there. There's always, and it's insidious, and now it's right here in our faces. Here it is. We can't really hide from it anymore. And obviously, a concern of mine is sort of, I think that the level of hate speech that we're experiencing seems to beget a lot of violence on a regular basis every day that you turn on the news. So it's like sort of the cork is out of the bottle now. But I don't think you can censor people, because to the book's point, you do that and you subjugate people further, and then you create martyrs. And then you have splinter groups. And then they're deep in the web where, you know, our government cannot monitor it. And they're creating more groups and more hate, and it sort of feeds it. So if you tell people they can't, they're going to. And I think it's a slippery slope when you start trying to censor that, even though having to listen to it is incredibly painful because it's so ugly. There's so much vitriol. It incites people. It's really hard for our kids to grow up in that world. It's a scary place for them. You know, I was at the movies a couple nights ago, and I thought, I wonder if someone's going to come in here and shoot us up. I had never thought about that before, but it's sort of a reality that's right there now. And I think that it's a global problem. But for us right here, it's something that I think, as everybody has said, is going to take a lot of soul searching, and we can't be silent.
Right.
If we're on that subway, you got to say something, but it's scary because the stakes are really high, I think. But I don't think that we can live in fear, at least not in this country, because people fought for us to have this freedom, and I think we have to do that. So, yeah.
Another thing that I appreciated from the book was the emphasis on education and how that really plays a role in helping to expand people's understanding and, to your point earlier, allow you to have empathy towards others. And I was really impressed with what happened in Skokie and the fact that decades later there was then an educational center that has been built to expose people to different ideas. And instead of censoring, that it really, through education, you can teach people and hopefully address the next generation so that they understand the impact of hate speech, but also that there are other forces which hopefully will overpower those.
Yep. Steve?
I'd like to build off on what the chief was just talking as far as education goes. You can talk about education in your school systems and in your towns and everything, but to me the basis for the way that you treat people is the way you were brought up. It has to start in the home. It has to start with your parents teaching the kids the way to behave in public, what's right and what is wrong. And if it's not there, if that basic instruction from the time you're a toddler up till you leave the nest isn't there, then the potential for all these outside forces to come in and influence your kids, the ones that you're responsible for, just as it's not there.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great point.
Yeah. I do have to say, though, like the conversation we're having tonight gives me so much hope. I mean, I don't know I know some of you here personally, but I'm just taking a wild stab at saying we come from, you know, in this room alone, in this tiny room, we probably represent very diverse political opinions, our background, so many things are different, and yet we're here having a conversation, and I feel that the room is very unified about what we would all like to see, even if we have a different lens maybe through which we see the world or our own experience. And so I feel like, you know, this is why we want to do this show.
Right.
You know,
Right.
to have this conversation, and then maybe it will branch out, you know, from different towns to, from Holliston, and we can really set an example of how to talk about these things with one another. So I always remain hopeful You know, it's just in my nature. But to just address what you were saying, right, it is a different time, and I think what you said is exactly right, and it goes back to what you were saying, Catherine, that we might have fear in those situations, but we have to find it. We have to dig deep and address that fear and override it in order to make any meaningful change.
I mean, there's really no basis to what I'm going to say, but in terms of hateful speech, it's usually perpetrated by bullies, who are usually cowards, who, if they're spoken up to, back down. And, I mean, maybe somebody wants to play off of that.
I'm going to agree with you on that. Go ahead.
I had a slightly different question because this is such a smart group. You know, the author's addressing the idea of censorship. I'm wondering about, you know, the sort of flip side. What can a group like us do, and what are your thoughts about those who don't have enough of a voice, or those who can't even get the smallest eke out without facing recrimination or fear? Like, how do we balance the equation so that we're hearing, you know, not too much from them and something from them?
Right.
That's where I really struggle.
Yeah, agreed. Did you want to say something on that?
I'm the holder.
You're just holding the microphone for us.
So I would just say, too, that in response to that, you know, I think also it's remembering that we have a history as a country and that hate hits some people harder than others.
Right. That's right.
And both from, you know, generations of trauma and experience of living in this country, if you're a person of color, and that I think so that on both sides of that, I think that not only requires empathy and education, but it also sort of should prompt us to have conversations about asking questions like, you know, not what's wrong with, you know, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, so much of our lived experience can help inform some of these sort of closer connections, which once we can understand each other's lived experience, I think that we deepen our empathy to be sort of better defenders of free speech.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so why don't we take one more comment from the crowd, Matt?
So just to kind of like wrap it up back up to where we were talking about censorship, I think it ties in how important it is to be careful of what we do censor, because throughout history, in terms of just not even the United States, but any country who has tried to implement free speech, typically it's always the minority who is being the one that's censored, so that the people in power are the ones who want to get their point across, and they're the ones censoring the typically vocal minority. Mm-hmm. And
yes.
Yep.
That's a really
great point. Go ahead,
Did you want to
Steve.
say, go ahead?
On that, part of that is that the people that are digesting the news, not the people that are reporting it, but they don't want to hear what the little guy is saying. They want to hear what the people at the powerful levels are saying. That's what's going to sell the advertisement and sell the newspapers. I'm not going to blame the media for all of it, but I think they share a huge blame on this. But if we were to give the same voice to all levels, and levels is probably not a good way to say that, but then people would have to listen. But they don't give that. They want to, you know, okay, they're going to give the president his coverage. They're going to give senators their coverage. And by the time it filters down to, let's say, the voters, it's not a whole lot of news time left. So we're not going to hear those opinions.
Well, then, I mean, then you have to look at those people that are in those positions or positions of authority or collectively and have them say, I need to hear from that guy or that woman. You've heard enough from me. I need to hear from them.
And we're hearing from all of you tonight.
Right. Right.
Isn't that what representative government is supposed to be about in the first
Absolutely.
place?
Yep. Yep.
Absolutely it is. One thing before we wrap it up tonight, first of all, we just want to thank you so much for coming out and being a part of this this conversation. I think it's so important, and I just want to thank you so much. And then, John, did you just want to tell them what we're going to do next time?
Sure, but I also wanted to thank the crowd. We got contributions from each person in the studio audience, and I think I've learned a lot.
Me too.
From all of them, and I think it was a great book to read. Hopefully you learned a lot from that as well. So we will move on to the next show with the date to be determined. It's going to be a book called From Disgust to Humanity, and it's about same-sex marriage. So we're moving on to the 14th Amendment. For those out there that are watching, if they want to start studying up on equal protection under the laws. Our first show was on the 4th Amendment, search and seizure. Free speech on this one. We're all over the board.
I was going to say we're going in no particular order.
But we're going to cover them all.
Should we tell them our secret method of choosing? We go
sure.
we go back and forth, and I'm like, okay, it's your turn to choose, and we just choose whatever we feel like is up and important to talk about.
I mean, just for the people that might have just tuned
Yeah.
in tonight, but it's based on a 17-book series that addresses constitutional issues. And most of them, if not all of them, are written by constitutional scholars. So, thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.